Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, is Guam the next Pearl Harbor?
So, if push comes to shove over Taiwan, Guam is in the thick of it. No question about it.
Today's guest is longtime foreign correspondent, investigative reporter, and author Christian Caryl. Christian was an opinions editor at the Washington Post, the Moscow and Tokyo bureau chief for Newsweek, and an editor and columnist at Foreign Policy. His piece on Guam is in the latest issue of the Washington Monthly. Hi, Christian. It's great to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So what I loved about your piece for the Washington Monthly is that it's about Guam, which probably isn't taking up a lot of real estate in most people's minds. You know, as you write in your article, most people probably don't know that Guam is a territory of the United States and its residents are United States citizens. You know, I think maybe people are vaguely aware of Guam's importance during World War II, that it's somewhere in the Pacific. So if we could start by your telling us a little bit more about Guam. Give us a brief biography. Who lives there? Just how small is it? Where is it?
Yeah, well, it's about 6,000 miles west of California. It's much closer to Japan and China than it is to the United States. But it became part of the United States in 1898 when we fought Spain in the Spanish-American War. Spain had colonized it back in the 17th century, and so it was dominated by Spain for many centuries. So then William McKinley, Trump's great idol, annexed it to the United States after the Spanish-American War, and ever since then it's been an American territory. It's just not a state, though. It's what we call an unincorporated territory, meaning it is entirely part of the United States, but its residents have no right to vote in presidential elections. They have a non-voting delegate to Congress. And that itself, brings a lot of complexity and complication to all of this. It's not a terribly huge island. It's about the size of Chicago, the city of Chicago, 217 square miles. It's about 30 miles long. So in the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean, it's just another fly speck, really.
Well, the interest people might take in Guam now is raised by your piece in the Washington Monthly, and it catches my attention that you're quoting security experts who are saying there could actually be armed conflict over this island as early as 2027 or earlier. Can you explain that scenario to us? Because as Ann said, a lot of people are out there thinking, wait a minute, I didn't think about Guam at all until now.
Yeah, well, of course, the key word to mention in that context is Taiwan. Guam is pretty close to Taiwan. It's much, much closer to Taiwan than any other American territory. It is part of the United States. And that makes it a very important base for the American military because, we have bases in Japan. We do have the capacity to station forces in the Philippines. We have aircraft carriers moving all around the Indo-Pacific region, but Guam is U.S. territory, which means we don't need anyone else's permission to put planes and submarines and ships there. And that's very, very important in the event of war with Taiwan. For some aircraft, Taiwan is just, a 2-hour flight away. It's very, very close. And in the event of war, a lot of our military assets will be moving to Taiwan from Guam because we have so much materiel stationed there. It's the largest base for American aircraft, and the most effective base for American aircraft in the Western Pacific. It has the largest fuel storage facility of any base in the United States Air Force. So in the event of war, it's going to be an absolutely crucial staging position, and that's why it's often called the spear point of the U.S. military. And the Chinese have actually developed an intermediate range ballistic missile, the DF-26, which can reach Guam from China. And American war gamers, for example, at the famous think tank in Washington, the Center for Strategic International Studies, do a Taiwan war game periodically. And in every iteration of that game, the Chinese side begins by a full-scale attack on Guam, specifically on Andersen Air Force Base, which is the absolutely gargantuan Air Force base that we have there. So if push comes to shove over Taiwan, Guam is in the thick of it. No question about it.
What's the likelihood, you think, though, of China actually being an aggressor around Taiwan? I actually saw something this morning, an op-ed from a Taiwanese official who was speculating that because of Trump's abandonment of Ukraine, possibly, um, America may be less inclined to go to the defense of Taiwan. Of course, that would change if China decided to attack Guam first. But how do you see this all playing out with what's happened in Ukraine? What's the connection between that and what the Chinese see as Trump's possible response?
Well, certainly Trump's attitude towards Ukraine is probably emboldening the Chinese because he's basically saying the U.S. doesn't want any fights that don't affect its own immediate national security. That's the message, I think, that's coming across from what he's doing. The larger issue is that his position on China as a whole has become very, very ambiguous. I touched upon this in the article, but I didn't really think it was an article about China policy, so I didn't get into it too deeply. But a lot of people like me who watch American national security policy are scratching their heads over China, over Trump's China policy. It's really not clear where he is. One day he's talking about how he's going to slap China with these gigantic tariffs. The next day he's talking about how he and Xi Jinping are the best of buddies and how much he loves Xi. It's really pretty extraordinary. And whenever the talk comes around to Taiwan, he starts scolding Taiwan for, you know, its policy on semiconductors and its industrial policy, and it's so unfair and it's so horrible. One thing we've not heard from him is a clear and unambiguous statement of support for Taiwan. You might recall that in Joe Biden's presidency, he did away with the policy that we called strategic ambiguity, under which the United States, kind of hedged on the issue of what it would do in the event of some kind of aggressive action over Taiwan. Biden came out and said, well, we're going to defend Taiwan, right? That was really pretty extraordinary and really rather clear. And with Trump, the signals are quite mixed. So if I were China, I might be saying, madman theory. This guy is such a kook that, we shouldn't do anything because there's no telling what the hell he might do. On the other hand, they might be saying in their usual subtle Chinese way, see these signals that he's sending us. He's very gently and quietly letting us know he's not going to actually do anything if it happens. Now, I've said all that. Now, guess who just went to Guam over the past week? Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, went to Guam and boasted about how he had a grandfather who was stationed on Guam. And he talked about how important Guam is in American security and how it's a linchpin to the Indo-Pacific region, which was startling because one of the things I mentioned in the article is that during his first term, one of Trump's aides started talking about Guam and its military significance, and Trump told him Guam isn't part of the United States. So maybe we're seeing again, a kind of shift in American policy towards acknowledging Guam's importance in a potential conflict with China. Your guess is as good as mine at this point, really.
But when you say Hegseth is sending signals, that has a dual meaning in itself, right?
Yeah, yeah, and he sent those signals without using signal, so that in itself has means something, I guess.
Exactly.
He was totally in the clear about his signal. Well, I don't know. We could probably go on for hours, but I don't work for Saturday Night Live, so
Well, Guam has been an object of contention and armed conflict since 1898 and the Battle of Guam. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah. Well, in World War II, the Japanese bombed Pearl. They began the our phase of World War II, I should say, by bombing Pearl Harbor, and at about the same time, they also swooped in and attacked Guam because they understood then as now that it was a linchpin to the Western Pacific. They came in, and the U.S. basically, its defenses were quite minimal at the time. We hadn't prepared for a Japanese assault on the island. So the U.S. Navy basically just gave it up and skedaddled. And Guamanians have never forgotten that. That was quite a traumatic event. A lot of people in Guam to this day are actually quite patriotic and keen to show their bona fides as American citizens. But in this case, they felt betrayed, and they were then subjected to 2.5 years of horrible Japanese occupation, which included forced labor and rape and all kinds of horrible things. and then we came back, and took the island back after that occupation, and quite a serious amphibious operation. And ever since then, we've held it. It was very important. Guam was very important for helping us capture the Northern Marianas Islands, which then became the launch pad. Sorry, the launch pad for the U.S. Uh, nuclear attacks on Japan at the end of the
Mm.
war. So that again kind of underlines Guam's strategic importance.
One of the more terrifying things you talked about in your piece was this possibility of a Chinese attack on Guam, and you linked actually to a video that was posted by the People's Liberation Army Air Force showing the simulated attack on Guam. I watched that video, and it had a fireball, over Guam. Can you talk a little bit about like, what would be the human and material cost of that kind of attack? How many lives are we talking about? How does it compare to what an attack
Well,
on Pearl Harbor would be?
I think it would be absolutely horrific and devastating. There are about 10,000 uniformed American military personnel on Guam, but the overall population of the island, including military, is about 170,000, if I'm not mistaken. And they're all packed into a space, like I said, the size of the city of Chicago. It's an island about 30 miles long. So even if the attacks were concentrated on American military bases, those bases make up an enormous percentage of the overall territory of the island. So it's hard to imagine how Guamanians, so the civilian population, would escape, damage. I think a Chinese attack, if they were serious about it, one would expect them to be quite serious about it, would be pretty devastating, both to the military and to the civilian population. And actually, just within the past few days, I saw a representative of one of the Pacific Island nations talking about how, or actually of the Guamanian government talking about how, one thing we're very worried about is air raid shelters for the civilian population. There aren't enough. We don't know where to go. What happens in the event of an attack on the island? Civil defense seems to be incredibly underdeveloped, which is one of the issues I think that we need to think about in terms of Guam. But that video is quite striking because those bombers, and your listeners can look up the video quite easily, just Chinese attack on Guam. It was posted or recorded by a Philippines TV station, I think. The Filipinos, needless to say, follow all of this very closely. And those bombers, H-6 bombers, the big Chinese bombers, are nuclear capable. So if they wanted to toss a nuke at Guam, if they decided that was, I think that's an outside scenario, of course, but if they wanted to do that, they could. They've got intermediate missiles that can target the island. Thankfully, I guess, I'm not sure if I'm thankful about it, but those missiles are actually highly accurate, it would seem. So they probably wouldn't need to use nukes. But I suspect, for people under the barrage, it might not make a lot of difference because, if I were a Chinese military planner, I'd hit it pretty hard. I'd probably throw a lot of what I had at that island just to, stall the Americans before they even got going.
Well, you also mentioned in that article other interests, indications of China perhaps taking an unhealthy interest in Guam. You
Yes.
said there were some Chinese spies trying to enter the island illegally, um, and the famous balloon turned out to perhaps have been intended for Guam rather than the northern tier of the United States. I'm curious about, is that an ongoing thing? There's just a kind of hidden war going on about Guam and information in that regard?
I think there is a hidden war going on. We don't know most of it, I suspect. The spy balloon in 2023, as you mentioned, was actually supposed to be surveilling Guam. It turns out, and just went off course and went rogue. Um, I was really struck when I was looking at this recent arrest of Chinese spies, alleged Chinese spies, I should say. There were 7 of them arrested at the end of last year. I looked into some of the documents surrounding that, and it turned out that customs authorities and border security authorities have actually arrested something like 150 Chinese agents in Guam since 2022. So that seems pretty striking. In 2022, we also had a very large scale Chinese cyber attack on Guam, which included, this is very striking also, which included implanting malware into all sorts of civilian infrastructure and communication systems. So the Chinese understand very well that if they want to neutralize Guam, they don't need to just attack the military facilities, they also need to cripple civilian infrastructure. And again, the question for me always remains, what have we not found out, right? Because that's the malware we discovered. What about the malware we haven't discovered? There's always something else lurking out there. And it all seems very, very ominous indeed. Actually reminds me a little bit of those stories about Japanese spies walking around, you know, walking around Hawaii in the days before Pearl Harbor. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of operational security at that time before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I think we're probably more aware of it now than we were then, but still very ominous indeed, no question about it.
Now, Christian, you have been a Guam watcher for a very long period of time. And I saw that you wrote back in 2010 that the United States began taking kind of a strategic interest in Guam, or more of a strategic interest in Guam after the attacks of September 11th, and started building up the military assets position there. And you wrote that this was part of what former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld called the quote lily pad strategy of having this global network of jumping off points that would enable this rapid response to threats. So how is that particular lily pad doing in terms of readiness? Like, how ready is the United States, despite Hex's visit there? Is it actually militarily capable of defending itself at this point?
Well, I think actually within just the past few years, we've woken up to some of the problems of defending Guam, including a lot of those civilian infrastructure issues I mentioned. If you want to make Guam a really serious strong point for American forces in that region, you also want to make sure that the people who live on the island have adequate water and communications and safety network, social welfare networks. And in fact, the Trump cuts the Doge cuts have struck fear to the hearts of people in Guam, and they've actually been sending their representatives back to the U.S. to try to figure out what the hell is going on. Some of the Biden legislation sent hundreds of millions of dollars to Guam to boost civilian infrastructure, which I think was long overdue. We have a sense of people in the Biden administration kind of waking up. Holy crap, nothing's been done. We better rush resources to this island as quickly as we can. And you don't see that anywhere more clearly than with missile defense. We've really ramped up efforts to provide some kind of proper missile defense for the island. Just in December, we had an apparently successful anti-missile missile defense test that would augur well for the defenses of the island if it really was that successful. And so what they're trying to do now is to install a layered defense of the island with theater defense, which would extend many hundreds of miles beyond the island, and then Patriot batteries, which are a little more short range. And they've also been trying to set up something a bit like Israel's Iron Dome for shorter range missile defense. I'm not sure the Iron Dome thing is that practical, because Iron Dome was conceived for short range missiles, the kind used by Hamas and Hezbollah. So they're smaller things that don't fly very far, whereas almost anything coming from China will be from a long way off, unless they manage to sneak some subs up to, or planes in, which is a little less likely since we're pretty good at defending against that sort of thing. Famous last words. We have been undertaking a lot of efforts lately. But, you mentioned my story from 2010. When I was in 2010, the big news was, guess what? We've reached this agreement with the Japanese to move Marines off the island of Okinawa, and we're going to shift them all to Guam. And the Japanese are going to be so graceful. Guess what? The Marines still haven't quite arrived. The first 100 or so just arrived within the past few months. It's a small island. There's been all kinds of difficulties finding the right base, getting environmental protections passed. this, that, and the other thing, the usual, complicated bureaucratic snafus. And so, 15 years later, the Marines, hooray, the cavalry are coming, but uh, I don't know if they'll get there in time for the war, if there is a war. And I should add, of course, those of us who worry a lot about the Taiwan scenario understand perfectly well the Chinese would be happy to move in there without a war. If Xi Jinping can manage things so that the Americans just throw up their hands and the Taiwanese kind of effectively capitulate, and he can walk into the great palace of the people in Taiwan as a peaceful, triumphant, conquering leader. He will do that, absolutely. He doesn't. I'm sure he doesn't feel that he has to go to war over Taiwan. The objective is to absorb Taiwan. And if you can do that without war, you'll certainly do your best. So, neutralizing Guam or showing that you know how to neutralize Guam, that you have the weapons to neutralize Guam, anything that can get the Americans to think twice, that's already in the Chinese interest.
Right. And I guess there's some sentiment inside Taiwan as well that maybe peaceful surrender might be the only option given, especially now, given Trump's refusal to defend Ukraine and the
Yeah.
betrayal of.
I think those sentiments are quite, from my own brief visits to Taiwan, those sentiments seem quite widespread. Even if you are worried about a Chinese move on Taiwan, you might not, there seems to be a lot of denial among ordinary people in Taiwan. You just might not take it that seriously. Oh, we've lived this way for, ever since 1949. What the hell is going to happen? You kind of encounter that in South Korea with the North Koreans. Oh, we've been living with them for so long. Don't be hysterical. It's, why would they do that? It's not in their interest. But I think it is very much something that the Chinese Communist Party has been thinking about very deeply and very carefully for years. So I think it would be wrong of any of us to discount the possibility. That's my take.
We've talked a little bit about the dilemma of the civilian population of Guam. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the history of these people. The Chamorro population and their relationship. They are U.S. citizens. Uh, can you tell us a little bit about what they've been through and what their attitudes are about all of this?
Well, I think they've been through a lot. Many years ago, they were actually accepted by the United Nations as a colonized people. And they've been one of the peoples that have periodically talked to the United Nations about decolonization efforts, which can take many different forms. Doesn't necessarily mean kicking the U.S. off the island. So there are a lot of tensions there, right? The Chamorro people have been really badly used. I think you'd be hard pressed to dispute that assertion at this point. The poverty rate on the island is very high. Welfare dependence is very high. At the same time, they are tremendously, by all measurements, patriotic people. I think they're very happy to be Americans, and it's very difficult for them that many Americans don't reciprocate that feeling because so many Americans don't know what Guam is or who the people of Guam are, right? They have an exceptionally high rate of service in the U.S. military, partly because, the benefits are good, and that's one way to escape the poverty on the island. But also there's a lot of genuine patriotism. I encountered it when I was there. The ratio of veterans of the armed forces to the civilian population is among the highest within the United States. It's really quite extraordinary. So I think there's a lot of tension between desires for more self-rule, more self-assertion and identity, expressions of identity. But at the same time, there's a deep sense of attachment to the United States and a bit of a feeling of, I think, sometimes unrequited love. This sense that that's where America's morning begins. That's the slogan. And the rest of America doesn't know that America's morning begins there.
Final question for you, Christian. Um, let's take it as a given that the current president is impervious to any sort of advice. But as far as cooler heads in a Pentagon, cooler heads in a Senate, those who care, what is your advice to them now about what they should be thinking about in terms of preparing Guam, preparing the United States, what should be happening at all levels of government?
Well, I think they should be taking the threat of insecurity very, very seriously. I think that all of these efforts to upgrade Guam's missile defenses are admirable and desperately needed. I think that cutting federal funding to Guam at this point would be a huge mistake. I think they really need to if anything, I think the government should probably implement an all agency, a cross agency inquiry into the needs of Guam and what can be done to bolster its defenses. An inquiry that would not encompass only the Defense Department, but also incorporate civilian government, because I think those two things are joined at the hip in Guam. You can't have a successful defense of the island without incorporating the civilian population, right? You either have adequate water and roads and communications infrastructure for the whole island, or you don't have it, right? So I think it's really, really imperative to think hard about Guam's needs and how to make it more resilient and resistant to possible attack. I think that's the bottom line. I'm not sure to what extent people in Washington really are paying attention. The Biden administration policy was quite striking because at the beginning they clearly weren't paying attention, and then at a certain point they woke up, perhaps because of many of these forecasts of imminent Chinese action against Taiwan. So I hope that sense of urgency will communicate itself to the new administration and that they don't just kind of, relegate it to some space at the back of their minds.
Well, thank you, Christian. This has been an incredibly enlightening and important conversation, and appreciate your taking the time.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure for me. Let me know the next time you want to have me on.
Would love to. Take care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.